The check was sitting on the kitchen counter when I walked in, and my son's father-in-law was leaning against the marble island with his arms crossed, wearing the kind of smile that men like him practice in mirrors. $50,000, he said, before I had even set down the toolbox I was carrying. Consider it a gift, a relocation bonus, if you will. I looked at the check. I looked at him, then I set my toolbox on the floor very carefully, and I said, I came to fix the garbage disposal. That was 3 years ago. And I think about that moment every single day. My name is Walter, and I am 64 years old. I have large hands that are rough in the places where hands get rough from real work. I drive a 2009 Ford pickup that has a crack in the passenger side mirror I keep meaning to fix. I wear flannel shirts in winter and plain cotton in summer, and I get my hair cut at the same barber shop I have been going to for 30 years, where a trim costs $14, and the man who cuts my hair asks me about my son every single time. What Gerald Harrington saw when he looked at me was exactly what I intended him to see. My son married into the Harrington family 4 years ago. His wife is a good woman, I want to be clear about that, because this story is not about her. She has her father's sharpness, but none of his cruelty, and she loves my son in the way that matters, quietly and without conditions. I was glad when he brought her home. I told him that the first night he introduced us, standing in my kitchen while I made spaghetti from scratch the way his mother used to, and I meant every word of it. The Harrington family, however, was a different matter entirely. Gerald Harrington had built the family name into what it was, or so he believed. He ran Harrington Development Group, a commercial real estate firm based in Charlotte that had grown substantially over the past 15 years. He sat on 2 charitable boards. He wore a watch that cost more than most people's cars. He was the kind of man who introduced himself by telling you what he did before he told you his name, because in his mind those 2 things were the same. His wife shared his sensibilities, though she expressed them more quietly. She had a way of looking at things that didn't belong in her house, objects, ideas, and occasionally people, as though they had been left there by accident, and someone would eventually come to collect them. The first time I had dinner at their home, I drove my truck and parked it in the circular driveway next to a Mercedes and a Range Rover, and I watched Gerald clock the vehicle from the front door before his expression settled into something professionally neutral. Dinner was pleasant in the way that dentist appointments are pleasant. Everything was technically fine and nobody was bleeding, but everyone was aware of an underlying discomfort that nobody wanted to name directly. Gerald asked about my work. I told him I did handyman jobs, small repairs, odd projects for people in the neighborhood. He nodded in the way that people nod when they are trying to decide whether something is sad or amusing. His wife refilled my water glass with the careful attentiveness of someone who has decided to be gracious toward the help. My son noticed. He is a perceptive young man. He has his mother's eyes and his mother's instincts, which means he reads rooms accurately and feels things he wishes he didn't. After dinner, in the driveway, he touched my arm and started to say something. I know, I said. It's all right. Dad, I can explain to them that you... It's all right, I said again. And then I drove home. I want to explain something, because I know it is the question that sits underneath all of this. The thing that people ask when they hear any version of this kind of story. Why? Why live the way you live if you don't have to? Why let people treat you a certain way when you could simply show them who you are and watch their faces change? The answer requires me to tell you about my wife. Her name was June, and she died 11 years ago, and not a day passes that I do not feel the specific shape of her absence. She was the kind of person who made every room she entered feel more honest somehow, as though her presence reminded people to drop the performances they'd been carrying around all day. She grew up with nothing, and she never forgot it, not because it made her bitter, but because it made her certain about what mattered. In the last months of her life, when we knew how things were going to go, she made me promise 2 things. The first was that I would make sure our son knew how to cook at least 5 real meals from scratch. The second was harder to articulate, but she found the words eventually. She made me promise that when the time came when our son chose someone to build a life with, I would be sure that the choice was real. That it was about the person and not the circumstances surrounding the person. She had watched what money did to people's judgment. She had seen it in her own family. Marriages built on calculation that collapsed slowly and publicly over decades. She wanted something different for our son. I had promised her. I intended to keep it. Now, what I have not told you yet And what Gerald Harrington certainly did not know when he slid that check across his kitchen counter was the other part of my life. The part that existed quietly in the background, invisible to everyone except my accountant, my attorney, and the executor of a trust that my late wife and I had established 22 years earlier. In 1987, before Harrington Development Group had that name or any particular reputation, it was a small regional real estate company that was struggling to fund an expansion into commercial properties. Gerald Harrington, younger then, and considerably less comfortable, had been looking for investors. A mutual contact introduced him to an investment fund I was quietly operating at the time, and through that fund I had taken a significant equity position in his company. The arrangement was structured for privacy, which was something I had always preferred in business. The fund had a name that told you nothing. Gerald had received his capital infusion, expanded his operation, and gone on to build the company into something substantial. He had never known who was behind the fund. He had shaken hands with intermediaries and signed papers and deposited money and built his empire, and at no point had anyone told him that the largest single outside shareholder of Harrington Development Group, holding 38% of the outstanding equity through a blind trust, was a man named Walter who showed up to fix his garbage disposal on a Tuesday afternoon. I want to be precise about something. I had not engineered my son's marriage. Life is complicated and love is not a chess move, and I had not orchestrated any of this. My son met my daughter-in-law at a conference in Atlanta where they were both presenting in adjacent sessions on the same afternoon, and that was purely the kind of coincidence that a universe with a sense of humor arranges sometimes. When he brought her home and eventually told me her last name, I sat very quietly for a long moment before I said that she sounded wonderful and I couldn't wait to meet her. I said nothing about the rest of it. I called my attorney the next morning. She confirmed that my position in the company was still structured exactly as it had always been. Anonymous, untraceable to me personally. Gerald Harrington, for all his resources and his connections, had never once looked behind the curtain because the curtain was very well made, and there had been no reason to look. My attorney asked me what I wanted to do. I told her I wasn't sure yet. I told her to keep everything exactly as it was for the time being. Then I hung up and went to fix a fence post for a neighbor down the street. The first year of my son's marriage was fine in the particular way that first years often are, when everyone is still deciding what kind of family they are going to be, and politeness functions as a holding pattern. Gerald treated me with the impersonal courtesy that he likely extended to his assistant's family members. His wife sent me a Christmas card that was clearly chosen from a generic stack, and signed with both their names in her handwriting only. The second year, things became more specific. Gerald had a habit of making certain kinds of comments, usually over dinner, usually directed at his daughter, but intended for the table generally, about the importance of good influences, strong networks, the right kinds of connections. He talked a great deal about appearances and what they communicated. He referred to what he called inherited limitations once, in a way that was technically deniable but not actually ambiguous to anyone listening. My son's jaw would tighten almost imperceptibly. My daughter-in-law would refill someone's glass. I would eat my food and say little, and let them say whatever they were going to say. Gerald offered my son a position in the company during the second year. A junior acquisitions role, entry-level in all but name, the kind of position offered to someone you're not sure you trust yet. My son is a structural engineer with 12 years of experience and 2 patents. He thanked his father-in-law and said he was happy where he was. Gerald's assessment of me crystallized sometime around month 14. I had come to their home 3 times to help with practical repairs, the garbage disposal, then a drainage issue in the back garden, then a section of fence that had come loose in a storm. I had offered these things because they needed doing and because I genuinely do not mind working with my hands. It is not a performance. I find it satisfying in a way that has always been real. Gerald had come to understand these visits as confirmation of what he had initially suspected. His son-in-law's father was a man of limited means and limited prospects, useful in a domestic capacity, not an embarrassment exactly, but certainly not an asset. He spoke to me with the friendly directness that comfortable people use with service workers, not unkind, technically, but containing within it a specific assumption about the nature of the relationship. I let him. I always let him. The check, when it came, did not surprise me. Not the fact of it. The amount was slightly insulting, which surprised me a little. $50,000 to quietly relocate and attend fewer family dinners, which is essentially what he was proposing with his language about a fresh start and giving the young people their space. But the principle of it, the idea that Gerald Harrington was the kind of man who would attempt this, I had understood that for some time. I fixed the garbage disposal. I told him I would think about the check. I drove home in my truck and called my attorney that evening. "I think it's time," I said. She was quiet for a moment. "The annual board meeting is in 6 weeks." "I know, Walter." She paused. "Are you sure about the whole thing? The scope of it?" I thought about the check sitting on Gerald's marble counter. I thought about my son's jaw going tight over his dinner plate. I thought about my wife telling me that the greatest thing she could give our boy was the certainty that he was loved for exactly who he was. "I'm sure," I said, "but carefully, all of it carefully. Here's what my attorney and I had been watching for the past 18 months, separate from the family dinner theater. Harrington Development Group was struggling in ways that Gerald had not publicly disclosed. 2 major commercial projects in the portfolio had stalled due to permitting issues and cost overruns. A refinancing they had been counting on had fallen through in the 3rd quarter. The company's operating position had weakened considerably, and several of the institutional investors who held smaller positions had already begun quietly reducing their exposure. Gerald had been managing the optics aggressively. He had restructured debt in ways that deferred problems rather than solving them. He had leaned heavily on the company's reputation and his own personal relationships to maintain the appearance of stability. From the outside, Harrington Development Group still looked like the successful company it had always been. From the inside, and from the vantage point of someone who had been a 38% shareholder for decades and had every right to see the actual financials, the picture was considerably different. I had said nothing. I had watched. I had consulted with my attorney and one trusted financial advisor, and I had made certain quiet decisions about my position and the appropriate timing for various things. Now the timing had arrived. The first thing that happened, 2 weeks after the check incident, was that Gerald received a letter from the trust's legal representative requesting an emergency board meeting to discuss the company's financial position. The letter was precise and formal and cited specific sections of the shareholder agreement. It was signed on behalf of a holding entity that Gerald had always thought of as a passive institutional investor, the kind that received quarterly reports and asked occasional questions through intermediaries and never made trouble. My attorney told me later that Gerald had called the number in the letterhead 3 times and spoken to a very pleasant associate who confirmed only that the meeting would be proceeding as requested and that the relevant parties would be in attendance. Gerald did not sleep well that week. I know this because my daughter-in-law mentioned to my son that her father seemed stressed, and my son mentioned it to me. And I said that running a business was demanding and I was sure he was handling it. I did not say anything else. The morning of the board meeting, I put on a suit. I own one suit, a navy one that I had tailored some years ago and maintained carefully because good fabric lasts if you take care of it. I drove to Charlotte in my truck, parked in a garage 2 blocks from the Harrington Development Group offices, and walked to the building with my attorney and my financial advisor. The receptionist looked at me the way receptionists look at people who don't quite match their expectations of who should be arriving. I gave her my name. She checked something on her computer, and her expression went through 2 or 3 changes very quickly before settling on professional neutrality. She showed us to the conference room. Gerald was already there, with his general counsel and 2 members of his senior management team. He looked up when I walked in, and for a moment, just a moment, his face did something involuntary, a kind of blink that happened behind his eyes rather than on them. Then he looked at my attorney, then back at me, then at the papers she was setting on the table. "Walter," he said. "Gerald," I said. "Thank you for making time." I sat down. My attorney opened with a clear and orderly summary of the trust's position. 38% of outstanding equity, held continuously for 22 years, with full voting rights on major operational and strategic decisions. She laid documents on the table as she spoke, each one precise, each one undeniable. The room was extremely quiet in the way that rooms get when everyone in them is trying to process something that conflicts with what they thought was true. Gerald's general counsel leaned over and said something in his ear. Gerald did not respond. He was still looking at me. "This is not possible," Gerald said. Not to his counsel, to me. "I understand why it feels that way," I said. "You came to my house." His voice had changed into something flatter and tighter. You fixed the garbage disposal in my kitchen. You. He stopped. Your disposal had a faulty impeller, I said. It would have backed up again if I hadn't replaced the whole mechanism. I left a note about it. The financial presentation took 40 minutes. My advisor walked through the company's current position with the careful thoroughness of someone who is prepared for every possible question and is in no particular hurry. He outlined the specific concerns regarding the debt restructuring, the stalled projects, the exposure on the refinancing, and the projections if the current trajectory continued without intervention. Gerald's general counsel asked several pointed questions. My advisor answered them all. When it was done, my attorney explained clearly what the trust was and was not asking for. We were not asking for the company to be dissolved. We were not asking for immediate repayment of any kind. What we were asking for, what the shareholder agreement provided for, in language that had been sitting in that document for 2 decades, was a change in executive leadership and a third-party operational review, to be completed within 90 days, with a restructuring plan presented to the board at the end of that period. Gerald had been very still for the last several minutes. You want to remove me from my own company, he said. From the executive role, yes, my attorney said. Your equity position is unaffected. You remain a significant shareholder. This is he. Looked at me again. Why? Why now? Why this way? There are moments where a person has the option to say the sharp thing and the true thing, and these are not always the same thing. I had thought about this question for a long time. I had practiced versions of the answer. What I said was, because the company needs it, and because I think you knew that already. His general counsel began to say something about a challenge process and the timeline for notification. My attorney responded in the precise, even way that she has always had, which communicates without unnecessary drama that she has anticipated every possible response and prepared for it thoroughly. Gerald was not listening to either of them. He was looking at his hands on the conference table, and his face had gone through all the stages it was going to go through, and what was left was something quieter and more complicated than I had expected. Not the collapse of a man performing his own dignity, something else. Something that looked almost like a person recognizing, for the first time in a while, what was actually true. The check, he said. The $50,000. I didn't cash it, I said. He nodded slowly. No, he said. I suppose you wouldn't. I want to tell you that the hard part was the board meeting, but the hard part was actually later that afternoon when I called my son. I told him I needed to explain some things. He was quiet while I talked, the way he has been quiet since he was a small boy when he was working something out internally, and I told him all of it. The trust, the company, the 22 years. The reason I had never told him, which went back to his mother and the promise I had made and the belief that he deserved to be loved for who he was without the weight of what I had sitting behind him. When I finished, there was a long silence. Dad, he said. I know, I said. Why didn't you? He stopped, started again. All those dinners, all the things they said, you just sat there. Yes, I could have. Could have what? I said gently. What would have been different? You would have known. Your wife would have known. Her parents would have known. And not one thing between you and her would have been as certain as it is right now, because you chose her before any of this. And she chose you before any of this. And that is the only part that I cared about. He was quiet again for a long time. Mom made you promise, he said finally. It wasn't a question. She made me promise, I said. I'm angry, he said. I know. I'm also, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. My daughter-in-law called me the following morning. She is a direct woman, which I have always liked about her, and she didn't approach the topic sideways. She said she understood why I had done what I had done, and she was not entirely sure how she felt about it, and she thought it would take her some time to sort through all of it. She said her father had come home from the meeting the night before and sat at the kitchen table for a long time without speaking, and that she had sat with him, and that they had talked in the way that she and her father had not talked in a very long time. She said he had asked her, during that conversation, whether she was happy, not generally. Specifically whether she was happy with her life and her husband and the choices she had made. She said she had told him yes, completely and without hesitation, and that his face had done something complicated when she said it. I told her I was glad she had told me that. I meant it. The operational review found what my advisor had already outlined. A restructuring plan was developed. A new CEO was brought in from outside. A capable woman with a strong track record in exactly the kind of recovery situation the company was facing. Gerald retained his equity position and, eventually, an advisory role that he seems to have accepted with more grace than I would have predicted from the man I watched at those dinner tables. His wife called me once, 2 months after the board meeting. I was in my garage replacing brake pads on the truck and I almost didn't answer. But something made me pick up. She said she didn't know what to say exactly. She said she thought she owed me something and wasn't sure what it was. I told her she didn't owe me anything. There was a long pause and then she said thank you. And I said of course. And that was the whole conversation. My son and I repaired things slowly and properly, the way real repairs are done, without pretending the damage wasn't there. We talked more in the 6 months following the board meeting than we had in the previous 3 years. And some of those conversations were difficult, and some were long overdue, and all of them were honest. He told me things he had been carrying around since his mother died that he had never found the words for. And I told him things I had been keeping in the same internal storage facility for the same amount of years, and we were both a little worse for wear afterward in the way that you are when something that needed to happen finally does. He did not say he fully understood why I had done everything the way I had done it. I did not ask him to. Understanding something fully and accepting it and continuing to build your life are not always the same process at the same time. And I have learned that the hard way over 64 years. Here is what I know, though. I know that when my wife made me promise those things at the end, she was trying to protect our son from a particular kind of damage that neither of us had language for yet. The damage that comes from never being certain, from wondering, in the quiet moments, whether the life you're living is something people chose or something they settled into because the circumstances made it convenient. She wanted him to know that the people around him saw him, not the circumstances, him. I think she was right to want that. I think she was right about most things. What I got wrong was simpler and harder than the grand strategy of it. I got wrong the assumption that I was the only person in the equation who deserved to be trusted with the truth. My son is not a child to be protected. He is a man who has built a real life with a woman he genuinely loves. And he had the right to make all his choices with full information, and the fact that he would have made the same choices does not entirely absolve me of having taken them from him. My wife would have told me that. She would have said it without being unkind about it, which was one of her particular skills, telling you the exact true thing and making you feel respected rather than diminished by hearing it. I am working on understanding this. I have some time. Last month, my son came over on a Saturday afternoon, and we replaced the water heater together. The old one had finally given out, which I had been predicting for 2 years. We worked for most of the afternoon without talking much, which is its own kind of conversation if you know how to read it. When we were done, we sat on the back porch, and he had a beer and I had coffee, and the light was going the way it goes in October, turning everything a color that doesn't quite have a name. He said, "You know what I keep thinking about?" I said, "Tell me." He said, "All those times I watched you sit at that dinner table and not say anything. I thought you were being patient. I thought that was just who you were." "It is who I am," I said. "Yeah," he said, "but it was also something else." I didn't say anything. "It was love," he said. Not like a conclusion. More like something he had just finished working out. I looked at the yard. The fence line needed some attention before winter. There was a section of the garden that June had planted 30 years ago that still came back every fall, stubbornly and reliably, the way certain things do. "Your mother would have told you sooner," I said. "She was better at this than I am." He nodded. "She would have told you that too," he said. I laughed. It was the kind of laugh that carries something else inside it, the way the best ones often do. "Yes," I said. "She absolutely would have." We sat there until the light was gone, and then we went inside, and I made spaghetti the way his mother used to, and he set the table without being asked, and we ate together in the kitchen of the house where he grew up, with the new water heater humming quietly in the basement, and the October dark pressing against the windows. That is the story I have been carrying. I don't know if I carried it exactly right. I know why I carried it the way I did, and I know what my wife would have said about the parts I got wrong, and I know that my son sat at my kitchen table last month and ate his food and called me the next morning just to say hello. That last part. That is the part that matters. That has always been the only part that mattered.